Now we're going to talk about the iliopsoas. So the iliopsoas is a muscle found in the anterior hip region. The iliopsoas is one of the muscles found in that region. There are many muscles in that region that are going to do the same action as it, but for the sake of this course, we are going to only work with the iliopsoas in regards to the anterior hip. So the iliopsoas, it's a muscle that originates at the lumbar vertebrae and the ilium. So the lumbar vertebrae is the low back vertebrae, so in this general area here, and the ilium, which is the curved part of the pelvis here. Its insertion is going to be the femur. So if I were to kind of point it out here with this TheraBand, it's going to run in this region here. So that is kind of where the iliopsoas is, in that area. Of course, it is bilateral, the same on both sides. And it is one of the muscles found in that area. The action of the iliopsoas, I'm going to bring that back. The action of the iliopsoas is going to be hip flexion. Remember, if the muscle crosses the joint, it has to do something with the joint. So if the muscle crosses the hip, which in this case it is, it has to do something with the hip. So we know that. Now, can we guess exactly what it does to the hip? If it runs in front of the hip, if it contracts, then it's going to result in hip flexion. So a little trick is if it crosses a joint, the muscle has something to do with the joint. If the muscle crosses in front of the joint, in this case at the hip, it's going to do hip flexion. So the iliopsoas is just one of the many muscles, but the only one we're going to talk about, that run in the anterior part of the hip, and its action is hip flexion. So I'm going to move him out of the way again. The iliopsoas is going to start at the lumbar. It's behind, and that goes through, it's inside me, the lumbar vertebrae and the ilium, and it's going to come from the back to the front to the ilium, and then insert on my femur. And because, I'm going to grab this again, it runs in this direction, generally speaking. If I were to bring the insertion closer to the origin, or if I were to squeeze the muscle, it would result in this. And this is hip flexion. So, the iliopsoas will be our hip flexor we will be talking about in this class. Mind you, there are many muscles that do contribute to hip flexion. But to keep it simple, we are going to say this is the hip flexor muscle for this course. So in order to concentrically contract the iliopsoas, we're going to do the same motion as the muscle's action. So the muscle's action, the iliopsoas' action, is hip flexion. So in order to concentrically contract the iliopsoas, we have to perform hip flexion. So this is anatomical position. Hip flexion is going to be when I have the decreased angle between my torso and my upper leg. So I can either kind of bring my knee to my chest or my chest to my knee to get that knee flexion. In order to really get the iliopsoas, we're really going to have to get that hip flexion moving. So one example that we can do as an exercise to concentrically contract the iliopsoas is something like high knees. So I'm going to slow it down and go just in marching so you can see. But high knees is when you bring your knees up to your chest. So notice my legs come up 90 degrees here as I'm alternating hands as well. As I'm doing this, I'd be going faster, right, for high knees. But to slow it down and I can talk, it looks like this. And as I'm doing this, every time my knee goes up, it is driving my leg up, which is resulting in hip flexion. So every time my thigh goes up, I am concentrically contracting my iliopsoas. So every time, let's say you are doing high knees, or every time you're running, or every time you're running upstairs, when your thigh comes up, you are concentrically contracting the iliopsoas. In order to stretch the iliopsoas, we would do the opposite of its actions. So the action is hip flexion. Hip flexion. So the opposite of flexion is extension. So we're not going to do this because this isn't a good stretch. What we're going to do is we're going to bring it back down to our yoga mat. So, the action of the iliopsoas is hip flexion. So this is hip flexion and the iliopsoas is contracted. But we're going to stretch the right leg. So if I were to get in this position, I'm going to bring my knee backwards. So there's this elongated. So notice I just went into extension of my hip. So right now, my hip is in neutral. My left hip, this hip that I'm pointing to, is in hip flexion because there's a decreased angle. My right hip is neutral. It's an anatomical position. It's nothing. My knee is in flexion, but my hip is neutral, anatomical position. But to stretch my right iliopsoas, I need to do extension. How do I do that? I am going to bring my knee behind me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to don't let my knee pass my toes. Keep my knee over my heel. I'm going to bring my knee back as far as I can, and I'm going to get that stretch right here. This leg is in extension. Therefore, this is a good stretch for the iliopsoas because it's the opposite of its actions. The job or the action of the iliopsoas is hip flexion. So this position here is really going to stretch your hip flexor. So try it with me. Get on the floor. Get in this position. The further back, so get down here. The further back you put your knee, the deeper the stretch. When you're doing the stretch, make sure your knee's not over your toes. Keep your knee right over your ankle. Now bring your knee back as far as you can and get that stretch. Switch so you can get both iliopsoas stretches done. Because if you do only one side, only one will get stretched. So that's the iliopsoas. Generally speaking, it is going to start in the lumbar vertebrae ilium area of the pelvis and go to the femur. Its action is hip flexion. There are many other muscles that contribute to hip flexion, but we're going to use this as ours. In order to stretch the muscle, we're going to do the opposite of the action. So we're going to do hip extension. In order to concentrically contract the muscle, we're going to do the same as the action, which would be hip flexion. So that is going to be the iliopsoas.